Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today I'm going to show you guys how to build an under $25 Aristocrats deck that is as low as I could possibly get this deck, because there's always going to be some cards that are just a little bit more expensive that we need in order to make the deck work properly. But before we actually get into the deck itself, don't forget to pound the like button, subscribe to Giant Monster Games if you like this video, and vote in the top right-hand corner of this video on what kind of deck you want to see next. So that's always a thing that happens. Anyhow, let's start out with what creatures makes this deck interesting and actually kind of defines an Aristocrats build. The first two creatures are Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat. We're running 4 copies of both these guys because they are doing the same thing for us. Zulaport Cutthroat says whenever a creature we control dies, our opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life, and Blood Artist does almost the same thing, but it's whenever any creature dies, our opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. So how can we use this to its maximum potential? Well, to start out, we can use Cartel Aristocrat, which we're running 4 copies of this, which gives us the ability to efficiently kill off creatures, specifically our creatures, not our opponent's creatures, because we can sacrifice any creature to give her protection from a specific color. Also, if you haven't noticed, this is actually where the deck gets its name from, because Aristocrats becomes an extremely hard card for your opponent to deal with, because we can sacrifice any of our creatures to chump block to affinity and back. But an Aristocrats deck would not be complete with only 1 sacrifice engine. The next card we have is Bloodthrone Vampire. Unsurprisingly, we're running 4 copies of this, and it is another sacrifice engine for us, but whenever we sacrifice a creature to Bloodthrone Vampire, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn, which means if we swing in with it, our opponent either has to block it or has to do something to it, otherwise it's going to become huge as we just sacrifice most of the creatures on our side of the table. Now, what are we actually sacrificing, you might ask? Well, we have 4 copies of Reassembling Skeleton. So Reassembling Skeleton is a 1/1 creature for 2, which doesn't seem that amazing, but if it is in our graveyard, we can pay 2 mana to bring it back into play. We can do this at instant speed as well, because it is not casting the creature, it is actually using its special ability. So that means if we have a bunch of extra mana, we can swing in with our Bloodthrone Vampire, and then sacrifice our Reassembling Skeletons, and then bring it back, and then sacrifice it again, and then bring it back, and then sacrifice it again, and do this until you're out of mana, which generally makes Bloodthrone Vampire really big, and makes Reassembling Skeletons a super big pain in the butt for our opponent. Also, it triggers with all of our Zulaport Cutthroats and Blood Artists, so you can see how the synergies of this deck are starting to work now. Now, we can't just rely on Reassembling Skeletons, so we have 4 copies of Doomed Traveler. So this guy's a 1/1 for 1, but when he dies, he creates a 1/1 spirit token, which means we get basically 2 creatures for 1 mana, and because we are going to be sacrificing him to something, he actually creates a bunch of extra synergy, which is fantastic. And the last card we have is 3 copies of Tidehollow Scholar, which is acting like a miniature Inquisition of Kozilek or Thoughtseize, because we get to see our opponent's hand and exile a card underneath him as long as he's on the battlefield, which can be super duper handy because we can prevent our opponent from doing the things we don't want. And once we get into a certain position, we can always just sacrifice this guy, give that card back if we don't really care, say our opponent is tapped out, and keep going with our master plan to do a whole bunch of weird indirect damage to our opponent. And that is all of our creatures, so let's talk about our spells package. The first thing we have is 4 copies of Lingering Souls. Now this allows us to get 2 1/1 flying spirit tokens, which we can use to get in some extra damage or sacrifice to any of our sacrifice engines if we want. And we have the ability to cast it again out of our graveyard, so it has flashback, which makes it really good because we can easily get a bunch of little creatures onto the battlefield, which we can then either chump block with, sacrifice to one of our sacrifice engines, or we can use it to get some small damage in with evasion, which is actually really good in this deck. So good, in fact, that we're actually going to run 2 copies of Zealous Persecution. Now, as you may have noticed, all of our creatures are really small little creatures, and we need to actually get them a little bit bigger to get that finishing blow in. Zealous Persecution gives all of our creatures +1/+1 until end of turn, and all of our opponent's creatures -1/-1 until end of turn. So we can actually use this as kind of like a board sweeper for our opponent, or when we're attacking in or going to be blocking potentially, we can actually make all of our creatures bigger, which can usually do a lot of extra damage. Now, what would an Aristocrats deck be without Rally the Ancestors? We're running 2 copies of this, and it allows us to bring all of our creatures out of our graveyard back into play, and then we can do all that cool sacrifice stuff we normally do with them. Keep in mind, you're going to be paying 4 mana to do this, and you usually want to do this on your opponent's turn. We obviously need to have one of our sacrifice engines and a Zulaport Cutthroat or a Blood Artist in the graveyard in order to make this work. This tends to be the special finisher that this deck does, but keep in mind, if you do use this, you need to sacrifice everything you brought out of your graveyard, otherwise it's going to be exiled. So it either needs to go back to your graveyard or be exiled forever. And the last card we have is 3 copies of Doomblade, because having some spot removal is always good, because you never know when you're going to get stains on your opponent's shirt. That's a really bad joke, I apologize. Moving into our land package, we have 11 plains and 11 swamps. Obviously, because this is super budget, we just don't have any money to put in special lands, but that is something you should really consider upgrading. Take a look at the upgrade section, I'll actually give you some suggestions on that. Moving over to the sideboard, let's talk about that now. First, we have Bile Blight. This allows us to deal with token strategies, go-wide strategies, where they're getting a lot of the same creatures into play. We have 2 copies of Disenchant, which allows us to get rid of artifacts or enchantments, pretty self-explanatory. 3 copies of Duress. This allows us to look at our opponent's hand to remove a non-creature, non-land card. Generally, we want to be using this on counter spells or burn spells, because those are the 2 decks that we generally have a pretty hard time with. It's hard counters and burn. Next, we have 1 copy of Lost Legacy, which we can use against combo decks or other decks that just have specific pieces we know we need to get rid of. Then we have 1 copy of Sundroplet, again helping us deal with burn or other high damage decks, so aggro decks usually as well. 3 copies of Suture Priest, which allows us to go against go-wide strategies, also allows us to gain some life if we are going against aggro decks. 2 copies of Tormod's Crypt. This allows us to deal with Dredge and other graveyard strategies. I'm looking at Tarmogoyf again on this one. And lastly, 2 copies of Tragic Slip. This allows us some extra removal if we are going against decks that just we need to get rid of stuff off the table, and 3 copies of Doomblade in the main board is not going to do it for us. And that sums up the entire deck, but before we end this video, let's talk about some upgrades. To start off with, let's talk about the lands that we could be using. If you have some extra dollars, you can be grabbing Marsh Flats and Godless Shrine. If you're on a little bit of a budget, you can always be siding in stuff like Isolated Chapel and Caverns of Kolos. If you're looking for some token generating upgrades, we have Hero of Bladehold and Brimaz King of Osak, which are both really good at creating bodies, which you can then go forth and sacrifice. As far as other value creatures, we have Athos, God of Passage, which allows us to take creatures back to our hand unless our opponent is going to pay some life, which is fantastic. Also, Dark Confidant, which is fantastic at drawing us extra cards, and if he's getting a little bit risky for our deck, which will probably never happen because we have nothing over 3 converted mana cost, you can always just sacrifice him off to whatever you need to get rid of him. And lastly, if we're sticking with Orzhov colors, we have Fatal Push and Path to Exile, which are both huge upgrades when it comes to removal. Now, the thing that makes Aristocrats really interesting is there's lots of different builds for this deck, and you can find tons of them out there if you actually really look around. Some of the cards that you could be doing if you want to go Mardu colors, so adding red to this, you can be using stuff like Mog War Marshal, Falconwrath Aristocrat, and Butcher of the Horde. These cards are all going to give you extra creatures or extra sack outlets or extra win conditions in the case of Butcher of the Horde. If you want to go Abzan colors, so adding green instead of red, you can always be using stuff like Collected Company because all of our stuff is super cheap, Voice of Resurgence, which is going to give you a ton of extra value whenever creatures die, and you can always sacrifice them to get more creatures, Kitchen Finks, which is a value sacrifice creature because it'll come back and you can sacrifice it again, and Satyr Wayfinder, which is really good at filling up your graveyard, so when you eventually rally the ancestors, you get a ton more stuff onto the battlefield. But that is going to finish the entire deck tech. I'm Adrian, this is Giant Monster Games. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe to see more content like this, and don't forget to game like a giant monster!